Good. So good evening, everyone. I'm going to ask you to mute your microphones if you're able to. You can unmute when you have questions to ask, or just wave your hands. Last time, I think we had a few more screens than I could physically see. So if you need to get my attention, just go ahead and speak up. But for now, if you can keep your microphone muted, that would be terrific. And I'm doing the slides a little differently tonight, so you'll see them in a larger image in a moment. I want to just start with a couple of housekeeping things. Some of you emailed me throughout the week with follow-up questions, and I appreciate that. You're not obligated to do that in any way, but if you do have questions, please feel free to contact me now or in the future. It's not just about this evening. We're here to assist you with all of the learning that you want to do. I want to start as I started last week. Again, it's kind of funny, but it's really kind of true also, which is I am not here to convert you. I am not here to convert you. I am not here to convert you. Don't convert to Judaism. Don't become Jewish. You don't need this service in your life. Service is the Yiddish word for trouble. Now that that's out of the way 3 times 3, I guess, or times 2, happy to study and to learn with you. And again, I really feel that I will be most successful if you leave this course. Somebody's unmuted, so I'm just gonna quickly scan that and see who that is. I feel I would be most successful if you leave this course fully confident in whatever spiritual tradition you decide you want to claim for your own, whether it's the one you came in with, or because you're interested in Judaism, a curiosity to follow that. I would be unsuccessful if I've turned you off to religion entirely, so that's not my goal. I also want to acknowledge, they teach in all good group work to talk about the elephant in the room. By the way, I once gave a talk with an elephant in the room. It was a petting zoo. They brought in a baby elephant. It was unbelievable. So there's a lot going on in the world all over the place, but there is certainly a tremendous amount of sorrow and bloodshed and destruction and pain happening in the land of Israel today, and in the Palestinian territories as well. It's a conflict that goes back not just to earlier in the week, of course, but generations and generations. And really, in my view, we're long past who started it, and it's really a focus now on who can end it, who can bring about peace. And obviously, it's going to take both sides to be able to do that. So I mourn, as I'm sure all of you do, for the loss of life. It is heart-wrenching. I've lived in Israel. I've lived in Jerusalem to see rockets raining down on neighborhoods that I've visited and neighborhoods that I've never been able to visit because of the security situation there. I have friends that are in bomb shelters right now, and I have people that I have never met that I know have been hurting in the Palestinian territories for a long time. So we're not going to solve that tonight, and I wouldn't be able to solve it based on what I can bring to the table to begin with. But it needs more than thoughts and prayers also. It needs good action. We'll talk more about Israel in the broader context of Jewish peoplehood next week, but I wanted to just acknowledge that without wading too far into a minefield that's a difficult conversation. I don't mind difficult conversations. I enjoy them. I do them for a living, but a difficult one to have in just a short amount of time to try to get to the other things. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to spotlight myself here, and I'm going to spotlight the slides, and hopefully this will work. So if you remember, look at that little fancy transition. So last week we talked about God, and that's my son Judah. He's going to sit in on the class, trying to convince him to stay Jewish. He's got ice cream in his hand, so that should help. So last week, I think that if I could summarize, the slides are really fuzzy. Yes, but hopefully not so fuzzy that we can't read them. Sorry for that, Ingrid. It's just kind of the way that I'm doing it here. Part of it's Zoom. I think we ended the class last time with sort of these 2 takeaways about Jewish faith. One is there is a God, an intelligence behind the creation of the universe. Whether you believe in that God or not is not required in Judaism, as you recall. This is the subject of a separate course that we talked about before, or with last week's class, I should say. But Judaism operates as if. Judaism operates as if there is a God. The question I think that we might have left with from last week is, does God care? Whether I have turkey or ham for dinner, does God care for or torture babies? And this leads to the question of revelation or Torah. So the care for or torture babies is certainly an extreme, but if you're going to distract me, I have to leave. But it goes to the question of what is expected of us. So if you remember in our last class, we really talked about godliness and how God expects us to be an extension of God in the world. But defining what that is not left up to our interpretation. It's not left up to us to decide, okay, God wants me to be this or that. In a religious system, as opposed to a spiritual system, those rules are defined. And in Jewish tradition, those rules are defined in Torah. And here I'm going to use the word Torah. Obviously, in Hebrew, it doesn't have a capital letter, but I'm going to use the word Torah with a small t to mean all of Jewish legal text, historical text. And we're going to explore what that means tonight. But let's start with some basics. So let's start with Hebrew. So the language of the Torah, the language that the Torah was written in, was the Hebrew language. Now, before it was written down, it was an oral tradition. But Hebrew itself is an ancient language going back to the times of the Bible. And Hebrew is written from right to left. That was easier, by the way, for the chiselers to chisel from right to left. I've never chiseled, but I'm told that it's easier to go this way than it is to go that way. It was written without vowels to force us to read in context. So if you read modern Hebrew, if you were to open up an Israeli newspaper or something like that, you would see Hebrew printed in just Hebrew. Excuse me 1 second. You would see Hebrew written in just letters without the dots that are the vocalization of the letters. If we consider consonants H and T, for example, we could read H and T as either hat or hot or hit or hut or heat or hate, etc. And so you have to know the context. So why is Hebrew written without vowels? One explanation, maybe it's a mystical explanation, is it requires us to dive in a little deeper. You can't just take it on its face. You can't just be a literalist about it. The reading of the Hebrew Bible, the reading of Jewish texts in general, requires context and interpretation. It's not a mystery. It's not hidden from us, but it is also not something that is so simple that you just take it on its face. So let me begin at the beginning. So these are the very first words of the Torah, the book of Genesis, the book of, in Hebrew we call Bereshit, written in Hebrew as they appear in the Torah. So this is actually written by hand by somebody called a scribe or a sofer in Hebrew, who's trained their entire professional life, usually from being a young child after bar mitzvah age, to learn how to write this particular type of text and to do so in a way with intention and with an attention to the laws around writing the text. I'm not going to go into all those laws, except for to say that when a scribe or a sofer is writing the Torah, it's a holy act. So you can see at the very beginning of this text, there's a very large letter. It looks a little bit like well, I'm not sure what it looks like. A backwards C, I guess. It's oversized and bolded. That's the Hebrew letter Bet. So if we think of Aleph, if we think of ABC, the Hebrew alphabet begins with Aleph, Bet, Gimel, and so Bet is the second letter. And the second letter of the alphabet is actually the first letter of the Torah. There's a whole story about why the second letter of the alphabet was chosen to be the first letter of the Torah. And it's a mystical story that gives sort of emotions and personifications to the letters. But the Jewish mystics, the Kabbalists, and here I'm not talking about Madonna or Roseanne Barr, but actual Jewish mystics and Kabbalists, taking nothing away from Madonna and Roseanne Barr, read into this and they say, well, look at that letter. It's constructed in a rather interesting way. It has it's closed on the top, it's closed on the right side, and it's closed on the bottom, but it's open to the left. It's open in the direction that all the rest of the letters and words and the entire story of the Bible flows from. And so why is this? Why does it begin with that letter? It begins to teach us that we shouldn't ask what happened before, above, or below the Torah, but really only what flows from it. Now, if you remember last week, I talked about how questions are important in Judaism. So I don't mean to say that you're not supposed to ask questions, but there needs to be a certain suspension of rational belief, of even scientific understanding, in order to dive into this story. Because if you start to think about the cosmos and evolution and the Big Bang and all of these things, then you begin to say, well, it doesn't start with Adam and Eve. It starts with an atom, an ATOM, not an ADAM, and cells and organisms and evolution and all those things. And Judaism does not in any way reject that. But for the purposes of the system that we are entering into, we start here. And so I would call that a legal fiction. We know that there is other stuff. We know and accept, and Jews are leaders in the scientific fields, that there is a whole greater understanding of the origins of the solar system, the origins of the earth, that the writers of the Bible could not have possibly understood. We barely understand it now, and we have all the advances of science and technology and computers and those things. But as we follow this system, we start from this beginning. It's a beginning, which we're going to get to in a second. So I want to teach that there are two Torahs. And by this, I don't mean an Old Testament and a New Testament, but a written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and an oral Torah, which is the Talmud, and which is a combination of other rabbinic texts. I'll explain how those relate to each other in a bit. Let me do one more slide and 2 more slides, and then I'll stop for some questions, okay? So when we read the Bible in English, it says what it says. And if you've ever done a Bible study in the religion of birth or the current religion of practice, if it's not a Jewish Bible study, you will often focus on what that word is. And so why does it say "and" here? Or what does the word virgin mean if we're studying Christian text? Or what does the word, mountain or sacrifice or whatever it is? We need to understand that all translation is commentary. So as soon as you take the original Hebrew word, which is impacted with meaning, Hebrew is a language which has a fairly limited vocabulary. So words can mean lots of things, again, in context. You start to add your own agenda to what you want the story to say. Let's take, for example, the very first words of the Bible, and my Hebrew fonts did not transfer here, so those letters on the end of the sentence are not Hebrew, but there were Hebrew fonts there at one time. So the very first words of the book of Genesis in Hebrew are Bereshit bara Elohim. Remember, we go back to the Hebrew here. The first 3 words, Bereshit bara Elohim. So we could translate that, if you've ever studied the Bible before, it's as well known of a sentence as, I grew up in the United States, as the beginning of the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, or the first words of O Canada. In the beginning, God created, right? The Torah begins, the Bible begins in the beginning. Or if you're a baseball fan, in a big inning. In the big inning? No? I'm only seeing a few people. Nobody's laughing. Okay. But if we wanted to say in the beginning God created, we would actually write it Bereshona. We'd use a different, thank you, Alexander, for laughing. We would use a different word. Rishon or Bereshona is actually in the beginning or in, and so Bereshit is not the word for beginning. It's half of an expression. It's not an appropriate word. So already we can see that translation is commentary, because we've translated Bereshit as beginning, but Bereshit is actually only half of an expression. Thank you, Deborah, for laughing also. And it requires the next word, the noun, but the next word is actually a verb. So Bereshit is in a beginning, in a opening. would be a better description. A opening, not the opening. It's not the definite article here, but in a opening, in a entrance. Rashi, who was a rabbinic scholar from long ago, a Torah commentator, he teaches that God was trying to teach us that we can't just translate, we have to interpret. Interpret. I can't say that word. And so, is it a beginning? Is it the beginning? Is it an opening or the opening? So let me pause there for a second and remove the spotlight and come back to you all for a second. So you're welcome to take your off mute for a second here. Hebrew, thank you. Hebrew requires one to think. So is it, because the translation is not particularly accurate, you could read it either way. What does it mean? What's the saying, in the beginning or in a beginning?
More than one.
More than one, but Ellie, tell us what's the significance of translating it one way or the other? If I translate it as in the beginning, what am I saying?
Well, that's definitive.
I'm not sure who's talking.
Deborah.
Not me.
That was
Yeah.
Deborah.
One as opposed to the possibility of more than one.
Right. Okay. So clearly definitive in that regard. One is a possibility of more than one. So does that mean that this then, if we translate it as in a beginning, that this text is exclusive? This is the only origin story? Or are there more origin stories within the Bible itself, within this text? Because if you continue to read, you would then come across the story of Adam and Eve, which is not the story of the 6 days of creation. You'd come across the story of Noah and the ark, or the Tower of Babel. These are all creation stories.
So they're all beginnings.
They're all beginnings.
Yes.
And who's to say which one came first, or which one is the definitive one? Or maybe the point is that none of them are. It's just a beginning. It's just a start. Because the start is not the most important part, right? Setting out on the journey, that first step, no doubt that's important. The destination is important, but of course we all know, and it's a long told story, that it's the journey and not the destination. So it's how you get from the beginning to where does Torah end, at the promised land. It's all the stuff in between. That's actually what we're really focused on. I do not read the Bible as history. It's a terrible history book. The dates don't make any sense. People live for 980 years. It's a lousy science book. They didn't know from science. There's no scientific method involved. It doesn't work that way. It's not even necessarily a great moral story. People do horrible things. I read the Bible as literature. I can read Shakespeare as literature as well. And that doesn't mean I have to agree with everything that Shakespeare says or does with his characters, or her characters, depending on your interpretation of Shakespeare. But from that, I can draw lessons about human nature, and I can draw lessons about my own humanity and how I act and interact with human beings, and interact with the world, and truthfully interact with myself. Not every rabbi is going to give you this answer. Many will be literalists, and the more traditional you get, the more literalist they will be. You got yourself a reform rabbi. And so, sorry, Alexandra, I got to bring up the chat so I can read the full sentence there. So is a book like Elie Wiesel as meaningful to you? Let me hold on to that for a second. So why do I read the Bible? I'll give you two primary reasons for me. One, it has the story of the human experience of human beings attempting to create a moral, ethical society in it. And it's the story of my people. So even though I don't read that as history, I certainly read it as folklore. And folklore and history are related because we've created systems based on that folklore. And the second reason I read it is the one that we're going to explore more deeply tonight. It has the rules in it, the rules that I've accepted for the system. So to the question of reading Elie Wiesel, is that meaningful to me? Absolutely, reading Elie Wiesel is meaningful to me. And Elie Wiesel will further illuminate how I should behave or how human beings should not behave. Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor. But for me, the primary text is Torah. So everything has to be viewed through the lens of what Judaism says is right or wrong, moral or ethical. And as we said last time, some of that is subject to the interpretation of the time, but a lot of it is timeless. So let's go a little further, unless questions or comments.
There were multiple versions of the Torah that were found in different places. Is that, and were they all the same?
So yes, there are multiple, we're talking now sort of things like the Dead Sea Scrolls and whatever.
Yeah.
There are for sure multiple versions of texts that exist within the Torah. If you remember, I only mentioned it briefly, I said that Judaism actually began as an oral tradition. These were stories. Think of them as like campfire stories that were told around the campfire or the dining room table that eventually at some point got written down. What does it take to write something down? You need to take a spoken language and make it a written language. You have to have the materials to write something down. You have to have the ability to transport and save and keep safe in, desert situations, these things that you've written down. And then to pass them on from one generation to the next without them being destroyed over time. So it really wasn't until 586
Babylon.
BCE, 586 BCE, that the Torah was written down
Babylon?
for the first time. I'm sorry?
Was that in Babylon?
Yes. So I don't want to get too far into the history here, but I guess it's important. So these stories were always part of Jewish culture, Jewish practice, Jewish life. In the year 586, the first temple was destroyed, 586 BCE, so before the Common Era. The first temple in Jerusalem, which is where the temple is today and all the fighting is going on around it, or was, at least it started around it, now it's everywhere. That temple was destroyed and the Jews were exiled. And while they lived in exile, there was a concern that they might never return. And with it, they might never return to the sitting around the campfire and telling the stories. I'm using campfire here metaphorically. And so what's attributed to a man named Ezra, who was known as Ezra the scribe, wrote down these stories. And then after recording them, when they came back 70 years later, in the year 516, more or less, he started to read them publicly. And now they become canonized. Now, oh, he used that word. He said it this way. Oh, he said Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob instead of, Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac, or whatever it is, and the sequence of these things. And now you start to get the canonization of the text, the anchoring of the text, so that it now becomes subject to interpretation, not just retelling. Let me go back to the slides here for a second. We can't simply translate the Bible, and we shouldn't try. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who died just recently, wrote in his book, he was the chief rabbi of Great Britain and really an incredible scholar, and later on went on to have a TED Talk and became very much of a popular figure in sort of modern spiritual thought. In his book, Not in God's Name, wrote, every text, everything we read, whether it's Elie Wiesel or Shakespeare or the Bible, needs interpretation. If you read the New York Times, it needs interpretation, right? We learned this in high school, that headlines don't always match the column itself. And if you read past the first paragraph, then you might even actually get into the story. And every interpretation needs wisdom. It's not just for somebody to say, oh, this is what I think. I mean, that's lovely, but I think that interpretation should be grounded in some sense of scholarship, some context, some insight beyond just this is what my gut says. Interpretation in Judaism is generally dependent upon what did other people say about it. Most of my studies in rabbinical school and having to do with text, we're studying what other people said about text. We're not developing what I thought about it. My thoughts come later, and they stand on the shoulders of all the thoughts that came before me. Every wisdom needs careful negotiation between the timeless and the time. Not everything that was true then is still true now.
Rabbi,
Look at social, we can look at social issues that might have been true in their day for whatever the context was. Here I'm thinking about role of women, slavery, LGBTQ, all, pick your issue, and the time that we're in today, and the knowledge and the wisdom that we have today.
Rabbi,
Yes.
it's just interesting how on the Supreme Court in the States now, that concept of originalism with these conservative people on the court just sounds like it's totally the opposite.
So there is a role for originalism in Judaism. It's going to come up not so much. It's going to come up in how the rabbis interpret the Bible, and it's really going to be one of the things that distinguishes between Reform or Progressive Judaism and traditional or Orthodox Judaism.
Yeah.
The more traditional or Orthodox you are, the more this is what the rabbis meant in their time. We're going to look at that specifically in one of the texts later on, if I can get to it. So a fundamentalism reads texts as if God were as simple as we are, and that's unlikely to be true. The Talmud, which is the commentary on the Torah, that's an oversimplification of what Talmud is, says that one who translates a verse literally is a liar. And I just love that quote. It is just more complicated than that. Everything is. And I would use as the example, your life. If I just judge your life by your Facebook posts, I'm going to get one view of your life. You make great food, you've had wonderful vacations, you are as tired of COVID as the rest of us. Your life is more complicated than that. But you don't share all of that, partly because you're private, even with Facebook, and partly because you don't even understand it yourself necessarily. So let's give the Torah, or let's give God the same benefit. That God is more complicated, not trying to hide things, but just there is complexity. And so when we translate a verse literally, when it says, you shall, a man should not lie with another man as he would his wife, a verse that I find incredibly problematic, to read that literally is to do a disservice to God, in my view. Okay, so now let's try to understand how these things relate to each other. So the Bible, I keep using the word the Bible and the Torah interchangeably, and I shouldn't be doing that. So in Judaism, the Bible itself is actually made up of three different collections of books. There's the Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses. Sorry, I'm not following the text, so I probably should have been, or the chat. I'm going to just make sure I'm not missing something. Okay. The 5 books of Moses in English: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. By the way, those names are thematic. In Hebrew, the name actually comes from the first original word, or unique word, not original, the first unique word in each book. So Bereshit is the name of the book of Genesis because that's the first word. There's no headings, there's no page numbers, there's no index or anything like that. It's just you just know it because that's the first part of the book. It skips 3 lines and the next book starts. So in Hebrew, for what it's worth, it's Bereshit, it's Shemot, it's Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim. Again, translation being commentary, when we assign Genesis to the name of the book, that means the origin of things, right? But it doesn't begin with the word Genesis. It begins with in a beginning. Then the next book is the prophets, and then the next collection is the writings. Prophets are people like Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezra, and writings are things like the book of Joshua and the book of Job. These are together known as Tanakh. Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. That's the Hebrew Bible. Hebrew Bible is made up of those 3 volumes. All of those books are in the Christian Bible. If I haven't said this before, just to be clear, as Jews, we refer to the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, not the Old Testament and the New Testament, for what is probably obvious reasons. If we refer to an Old Testament, that implies a New Testament. And as we'll discuss, Jews don't recognize a New Testament. After that, so that ends around the year 90 of the Common Era. Then something happens in the year 70 of the Common Era. The temple is destroyed again. And when that happens, there's a rupture, a seismic shift takes place in the Jewish people and the way Jews do Judaism. They can't go to the temple anymore and do sacrifices. That is such a cataclysmic event that they have to reinvent Judaism. This, by the way, is what's known often as the intertestamental period, because it's also around this time that Christianity is formed. And so you really have these two faith traditions. Well, you have one faith tradition. You have a faith tradition that bifurcates. It goes in lots of directions, but in the end, really only two survive: Judaism and a Judaism which doesn't look like the Judaism that existed in the temple time. Well, it looks like it, but it's not exactly the same. And Christianity, which is a totally new thing. The text that is developed at this time is the Talmud, and the key text for that book is called the Mishnah, which is the oral law. The example that I would use is that the oral law is the how-to manual for the Torah. So if the Torah says make a sacrifice of a goat, the Talmud will tell you how to sacrifice the goat, when to sacrifice the goat, when you can't sacrifice the goat. It will even answer the question, what is a goat? That itself requires commentary. And so, to the question of what is a goat, the rabbis will debate, what is a goat? Or more likely, they understand what a goat is. How do you sacrifice a goat? What do you do if the goat is sick? What if you can't find a goat? Couldn't you substitute a different animal? And that is the Talmud. And the Talmud is actually written in two different places. One's written in Jerusalem, in the land of Israel, and one is written in Babylon in exile. They're actually, it's kind of incredible without the internet, talking to each other through the text and over time. The Talmud, though, are conversations that take place as though people are sitting in the same room that never actually lived at the same time. So I'm trying to think of a good example. If you've ever gone on to a Reddit group or something, and you start to interact with somebody that wrote something 5 years ago, and that person might not even be in that Reddit group anymore, but is getting quoted again, that's not unlike Talmud. For those that don't understand what Reddit is, it's Talmud in some extent. So these are generations of rabbis and schools of thought that are arguing the minutia of things in order to get to the essence of what is required. A lot of energy is spent in the Mishnah and the Talmud trying to figure out, how do you sacrifice a goat? That energy is not spent in the Torah. The Torah just says sacrifice a goat. The Talmud will raise the question, I can't sacrifice a goat because the temple where the goat was sacrificed doesn't exist. Then what do I do? And that's where we get a new application of Judaism that the Torah never imagined, because it didn't imagine a world without the temple. And this is really a critical thing about Judaism. I think it's one of the reasons why we are such a resilient religion and tradition, is that we were willing to reinvent ourselves without throwing out the whole thing. So trying to adhere as close as possible to the essence of the text and the tradition, while still creating a functional system. Now it gets more complicated. This is like the worst organizational chart you've ever seen, right? I'll take myself off the screen to see if I can make this a little bigger for people to see. So we have the Torah, we have the Talmud, and then in the year 500 CE or so, the year 800 CE, the rabbis who are debating the Talmud, they decide that their students cannot continue to write in the debate. They look at their students and say, not these guys. And they were all guys back then. They're not smart enough. We don't trust them with this tradition. And by the way, that happens all the time. And so they closed the book. What had been a living document, what had been a response to modernity, what had been really, for those that are lawyers on here, what had been legal precedent, now becomes canonized. It becomes much closer to constitutional law that doesn't change, and not active court cases. And so you get commentaries on the Talmudic text. And there's a whole bunch of them, everything from the Kabbalah, which is the Zohar, to people like Rashi that I was mentioning before, Maimonides, you might have heard of him. There's something called Midrash, which is literature about this stuff or folk tales about this stuff. You even get the development of a prayer book, which is really a commentary on all of this. It would take an entire couple of classes for me to explain how these relate to each other. This is a taste of Judaism. It's just enough to know that there is more to it than just the Torah. Speaking of the Torah, let me put myself back on screen here. On the screen on the left-hand side, that's a Torah scroll. We've invented books since. It's kind of hard to move from page to page in this, but that's how we've seen scrolls before. That's how the Hebrew Bible was written. And on the right-hand side, you can see a close-up like we've seen before of what that text looks like. The pointer that's being used there is called a yod. Yod means hand. When we read from the Torah, it has a melody to it. So a bar bat mitzvah student, a 13-year-old boy or girl, will learn to sing the melody that's specific to the passage they're reading. And though the notes they're like musical notes, they're not written in the text. So you have to know the melody. That's part of the challenge of learning it. And that's what it looks like. The Mishnah, which I was talking about before, which is part of the Talmud, is actually volumes of books. It was written down, and it was written down in folio form, not in scrolls. And they're printed, and most people have them. Many Jews will have a copy of the Mishnah. Many traditional Jews will have a copy of the Mishnah in their home. They won't have a Torah scroll. I do, but that's a separate story. This is the page of the Talmud. There's a lot going on this page. I wish I had time to explain it to you, but you can see that there's some clear delineations of things. First of all, you have that center column, that center box. It's hard to see here, but there's actually two texts, a top part and a bottom part. The top part is the Mishnah. The bottom part of that center column is actually the Talmud, or what we call Gemara, the commentary on the Mishnah. When I said that the rabbis in the year 800 said their students could not write in the text anymore, up until the year 800, all you had was the middle of that page. Everything on the outside is all of the commentary on the stuff that was written up to the year 800. That's all of their students who were not allowed in the middle. They weren't allowed to write in the middle of the page. They had to write in the margins, literally had to write in the margins, as you can see. Even those little things that look like footnotes on the very side, that is a school of thought. That's a specific type of commentary attributed to a very scholarly group of rabbis from a time. A set of Talmud has 63 tractates. So the Mishnah had 6, and the Talmud has 63. So we can see doesn't go exponentially, but we can see commentary begets commentary, begets commentary, begets commentary. But even that is done. You don't add more. Any new commentary is a separate volume, a separate book. All of this, when I say the Torah, all of this is Torah. Did I miss? No, okay. Okay. So now let's look at let me stop there for a second. And any questions so far?
Are you going to give us any kind of a copy of that?
Yeah, you'll get a copy of this slideshow. Just like I did last time. That's a lot of stuff to read. Yes, it is, Charlie. Any other questions before I move on? So how many goats are we going to need? I like that, Brian. Very good.
Makes me think of that
Gonna need
joke
a lot of goats.
about 2 Jews in a room and you have 3 opinions.
Right. Well, that's why you have so many pages of the Talmud. Any other questions other than Ellie? Okay. I love Ellie, so she's allowed to ask us anytime she wants. You all are. Okay, let me bring this back up on screen. So let's look at a page from the Torah. We now know what Torah is. This is a capital T. Let's look at a page from the book of Exodus, the second book of the Hebrew Bible. So in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, this part that looks like a time, 20:8, that's chapter 20, verse 8. It says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. The next sentence, 6 days shalt thou labor. Remember, this is all a translation at this point. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. Line 10. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. Thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. What are you not supposed to do on the Sabbath day?
Work.
Thank you, Ellie. Anybody else? You're not supposed to work.
You're not supposed to work.
So the question is, what is work?
Yeah.
Oh.
Right? Before I was making a joke about goats, but here's a better example. What everything is work. Not everything is work. Some things are joy. Some things are relaxation. I hope
Reading
not.
is not work.
Sorry?
Reading is not work.
Unless you do reading for work. And then
Yeah.
some reading is work.
Yeah.
Right?
And you got to take a break from that.
Right. I mean, I love to do woodworking and build things. If I build for a living, that's work. If I build
Yeah.
on the Sabbath day, is that still work?
Can you make that?
Work.
Can you make those decisions yourself?
Me personally?
Can one decide what they can and can't do?
So that's a great question. So work is subjective to the individual, Trav asks. No, you're not allowed to make those decisions yourself. Remember what I said before in our last class, the difference between religion and spirituality. Spirituality is religion on your terms. In spirituality, you can make those decisions yourself. Yoga is not work. Pilates is work. I don't know, whatever it is. In religion, that decision is made for you by the Torah. The Torah says what is work. And if you have a question about that, if it's not clear, then you go to the Talmud. And the Talmud will debate, is making a fire work?
Yes.
If it's rubbing two sticks together, maybe it is, for sure. If it is turning on a light switch, is that work?
Yes.
Okay.
You're
Well, we have a yes.
engaging. You're setting off a series of events by flicking that switch. Sorry, my audio is messing up. I said you're setting off a series of events by flicking the switch.
Okay.
So
but it
you're
doesn't say you
starting.
should not set
You're
off a
starting
series of events.
a work.
Okay, but it doesn't say you should not set off a series of events. It just says you should do no labor. And what labor is it that you're doing on the 6 days? So we're not going to answer this to satisfaction of everybody. It's just a taste. I want to show you though that this is where Judaism, I think, gets interesting.
Yeah.
So the question is not how I define work, but it's actually the question is how does God define work? Because remember, this is a system that's not defined by me. I didn't make the system. I'm accepting the system. I signed onto a contract. So how does God define work? And for that, we go to the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the Torah, is the rabbinic commentary on the Torah. So in the Mishnah we read, the primary classes of work are 40 less 1, 39. I don't know why they didn't just say 39. And here they are. It sounds like a song from Fiddler on the Roof. From Sound of Music, right? Sowing, sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheep, threshing, winnowing, cleansing crops, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking. I'm not going to read all 39. You can see them in front of you, pulling down, cutting it up, writing 2 letters, erasing in order to write 2 letters, building, pulling down. We're laughing, but extinguishing a fire, kindling a fire. Now, if your house is on fire, are you allowed to extinguish a fire? You have to let it burn. Striking with a hammer. Can you strike with a wrench? Can you strike with a rock that's not a hammer? Carrying out from one's domain to another. These are the 40 primary labors less 1.
What is the less one?
It's just the way they're saying 39. I don't honestly know.
Okay.
Actually, I do know.
Can you strike with the wrench?
Well, so
So that
first of all, the reason they say it this way, by the way, 40 is a Jewish number. 40 was the days that Noah was in the ark. 40 was the days that Moses was on the mountain. The rabbis know this is second level stuff, guys. But the rabbis know this. And so they want to make this holy. But for whatever reason, they couldn't come up with a 40th labor. So they go for 40 minus 1. Can you strike with a wrench? No. No. Not in this system. But it's not that simple. Okay. So let's read a little further. It actually gets a little more complex. So I'm going to skip down now to the Gemara. So we were saying Mishnah before is the oral law. The Gemara is the commentary on the oral law. Why state the number? Rabbi Yochanan said to teach that if one performs them all in one state of unawareness, he is liable on account of each separately. And that may not make a whole lot of sense to you, but the reason that they give, why state the number, so that one can be very, very clear which they are and which they aren't. So when we give a list, when Judaism gives a list, it is generally not all inclusive. The list is exclusive to just these things. So one could argue, if it's not on the list, it's not work. Another could argue, the list is actually, and the rabbis argue this, the list is actually about the intention behind each act. It's not scraping it, but the act of scraping and other forms of scraping. It's not hitting with a hammer, but it's the act of hitting things. But if we go back to the very beginning, we're talking about labors. So if you do these things and it's not laborful in your work, you do it because it brings you joy, you do it because it brings relief or relaxation, then is it a labor? I could give you an answer, and a different rabbi would give you a different answer. And in fact, in the Talmud, dozens of rabbis will give different answers, and it won't always say what's the correct answer.
Oh.
That's up to you, or up to your rabbi and your community. So that's why, if you go up and down Oak Street, where we're in a community of about 35,000 Jews, there are 4 synagogues on Oak Street. Because in one synagogue, this is considered labor, and another synagogue, that's considered labor. And some, they consider the same thing labor. And some are still working it out, and on and on and on. What does this mean? It goes back to the very beginning. I'll get to you in 1 second, Ellen. It goes back to the very beginning of where I started, which is why is Hebrew written without vowels? Because you have to read with context. What is the context? Not just originalism of when it was written, but also the context of the time you live in. Judaism is a living religion. Again, from my perspective, and honestly, pretty much every rabbi on Oak Street, maybe not the one at 41st, but which is the ultra-Orthodox. And I know him, and he's a lovely guy. We're actually close friends. Rabbi Weinberg. But it has to be read in the context of the times we're living in. That, by the way, is, again, what I think has kept Judaism alive. It has never been fixed. It has always been able to adapt to modernity. Slowly, perhaps, turning like a cruise ship, an aircraft carrier, use your analogy, but able to adjust to the times. When it doesn't adjust, it breaks. There's another teaching in the Talmud that says, what is it better to be like a cedar tree or like a reed? Now, a cedar tree has deep roots, but a strong wind will knock it over and it'll come crashing down. A reed has thin roots, but it's flexible and it will bend in the wind. The wind will not knock it down. The Talmud doesn't answer that question either. It leaves it to you to decide, or to your rabbi or community. Okay. I put this slide in not knowing this class. When I've taught this before, there have generally been a group of people that come to this class from Christianity and want to understand the relationship between Christianity and modern Judaism. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, but looking at the clock and trying to get to a whole bunch of slides, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. But just to go back to the intertestamental period I was talking about before, we have the biblical period. The temple is active and working. Jesus comes about around the year, well, born year 1, right? So year 30 or so, Jesus comes about, money changers on the temple steps, all of the stuff that's going on there. Jesus is crucified, not by the Jews, by the Romans.
Yeah.
There is a split. There is a rupture. The temple is destroyed. That's actually the rupture. The rupture was not the crucifixion of Jesus. It was the destruction of the temple. And what do? Religion that, as we know it, is no longer possible. And 2 lanes are created. Ultimately, Christianity, which talks about a messianism, and the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament become the text. Rabbinic Judaism, which is trying to salvage the remnant of religion as it was practiced in biblical times. One is a new operating system, right, or a complete rebuild, Christianity. The other is a remodel, a restoration. And it's all about how we read and interpret our sacred text that makes things different at this point. From that point on, and this is why when I do interfaith work, and I love doing it, the one thing we don't do is study the Bible together. Because in a nutshell, Jews read the Bible through a process called exegesis, and Christians read the Bible through a process called eisegesis. And if you don't know those 2 words or remember them from university, exegesis is to extract meaning from the text. So again, what are these labors? What labors are these? What is this trying to tell me? Eisegesis is to try to find meaning in the text. Where is Jesus present in this? Is often the question that Christians will ask when reading the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And it's just 2 different ways of looking at a coin. Judaism is a religion of commandments. In Hebrew, the word for commandment is mitzvah. It's not the 10 suggestions, it's the commandments, right? Bar bar mitzvah is someone who is obligated to observe the commandments, but it's not just 10 commandments. If you look at the Torah, just the Torah, forget about the Talmud for a moment. Every time God says do this or don't do that, that's a commandment. 613 times God says do this or don't do that. So Jews are obligated to, at a minimum, those 613 commandments. Things like love thy neighbor, don't eat pork, pay wages to day laborers each day. Those are Torah or biblical commandments. The rabbis of the Talmud added thousands more commandments against mixing milk and meat. All those 39 labors that you're not allowed to do on the Sabbath, the rabbis added those. That wasn't in the Torah, right? That the rabbis came up with that list. They were just trying to answer the question, what's a labor? So now you're commanded not to strike a hammer, not to make a fire. Well, fire was in the Torah, but how to slaughter an animal in a kosher way. Shabbat candles, bar and bat mitzvah. Certain holidays don't exist in the Bible, but exist in the Talmud. All of these become new rules for Jews to live by. So many rules that it gets really confusing. So much so, if I can go back to Christianity for a moment, Paul, not Jesus, and this is my standard answer, this is not my field, okay? I took a couple of classes in it, but it's not my field. But what is the fundamental response from Christianity is Paul according to Jesus, according to Paul. No, yes, Jesus according to Paul. I've come to simplify the law. What is Jesus or Paul, the Gospels, trying to simplify? All of this, the thousands of rabbinic commandments, which seem to many like a minefield. Like there's no way to know how to navigate these. And therefore, you don't have autonomy in your own religion. And I understand the frustration of that. It's why I'm a Reformed Jew. I demand autonomy in my religious choices within the context of community, but still ultimately autonomy. So from all of this, Jewish movements develop. We're going to talk more about this next week. Orthodoxy, which is the most traditional, all Jewish law is unchanging and binding on all Jews. Conservative Judaism attempts to try to have it both ways, honestly, to justify its changes by the text, but still open to change. Reform Judaism focuses on the ethical laws and is much more flexible on the ritual stuff, to the point that moral ethical is not a choice, but ritual is largely a choice. You can take it or leave it. Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg, who's a modern Orthodox rabbi who died recently, and a tremendous scholar and inspiration in my life, taught, I don't care which movement you're affiliated with, so long as you are ashamed of it.
What does that mean?
What does it mean?
It means why there are 4 synagogues on Oak Street and why many of the people that belong to those synagogues have belonged to all of those synagogues at one point or another in their life, or their family have. Because it's constantly evolving. I'm not part of this group. I'm part of that group. Well, I don't like that group anymore. I'm going to be part of this group. Every time you try to oversimplify something, you're leaving. I'm going to skip the Jesus and Messiah stuff. It'll be in the slideshow, but we don't have time for it. There was a lot of stuff. Separate class. I'm going to skip the Hebrew calendar too. I'll just go right to holidays. Okay, so there is a Hebrew calendar. It's a lunar solar calendar. It's complicated math. Essentially, well, just to go back to it for a second, there are 12 months, but sometimes 13. We add an extra month in certain leap years. The way the Hebrew calendar works is it tries to keep holidays in the same biblical time and season that they occurred. So that's why we have to constantly adjust. It's why Jewish days or months begin with a full moon. And when is a full moon? That's a whole subject of debate in the Talmud also. How do you know for sure that that's a full moon and not a waning moon or a not yet moon or whatever? But let's look at holidays for a second, and I'll run through these so that we have a sense of the Jewish calendar. We can skip this slide. So Passover, one of our most recent holidays. We just had it. Many of you, I think, from our hand raising, I think in the last class, have attended a Passover Seder before. It's, by the way, a survey just came out today from the Pew Center on American Judaism in 2020. Passover remains the most observed Jewish ritual, Jewish holiday, Jewish anything of the Jewish people.
Wow.
More Jews will attend or participate in a Seder than go to Rosh Hashanah services, go to Yom Kippur, eat kosher, belong to a synagogue, even have a bar bat mitzvah. There's lots of reasons for that sociologically. It happens at home, it happens with food, and it's built around a story.
Yeah.
Passover has a lot of symbols to it. Fundamentally, the story is of our redemption from Egypt, from slavery. And the primary instruction from the Passover Seder is don't forget that you were redeemed from slavery. Don't forget what it was like to be slaves. Recognize the slavery and the enslavement of others in the world, and don't let it happen to them. That's the story of Passover. Sukkot happens to be my favorite holiday, not one that a lot of Reform Jews growing up were very familiar with. It's generally associated with more traditional Judaism. It's the Jewish harvest holiday, the fall harvest holiday. It's known as the most joyous of holidays, and it's another feast holiday. You're supposed to sit in a booth that you make in your yard or traditionally in your field after having gathered in all of your crops and invite people over for a meal for 7 nights. Who doesn't like that? It's very closely connected with the earth. It uses symbols of these palm branches with the willow and the myrtle and what looks like a lemon, but is actually a citron. And you bless the earth. We were an agrarian people, so it's an obvious holiday connected to that. Rosh Hashanah is the Jewish New Year. You see they're blowing a shofar. By the way, Jews come in all shapes, sizes, and colors. The shofar announces the new year, and it was a traditional biblical, I'll call it an instrument, but it wasn't played as an instrument, but an announcing tool. On the right-hand side, you see some symbols of Rosh Hashanah, a round challah, symbolizing, usually a challah is oblong. A round challah symbolizing the cycle of the year, apples and honey for a sweet new year, the pomegranate, because all the seeds, if you count up all the seeds of a pomegranate, it equals 613. Does it always equal 613? No. But there's at least 613 seeds in a pomegranate, so I've been told. I don't really like pomegranates.
They're too bitter.
Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. We could do a whole class on atonement. Atonement's actually not a great word here, and how this plays in. But fundamentally, every Jew lives their life as though they're going to die the next day. And so you're supposed to repent for your sins. Supposed to do, in Judaism, it's called tshuva, or in Hebrew, it's called tshuva. Repair the wrongs that you've done. And your life is recorded on an annual basis in what's called the Book of Life. Yom Kippur is the end of the game. It's the closing bell. And if you haven't made all of your amends and fixed all of your problems by Yom Kippur, you're not technically out of luck. You get an extension period. But really, that's the end of the term. And you're judged by how you've done. So you got to fix all the wrongs you've done by that day. Now, since you don't know when you're going to die, you're supposed to do it every day. So you don't have this laundry list of stuff that you have to deal with on Yom Kippur. Hopefully, it should only be what you didn't do since yesterday. But we know that that's not how human beings work. On Yom Kippur, we fast for a 25-hour period. From the evening before, which is called Kol Nidre, which has in it a prayer where we ask God to absolve us of the promises we made to God, but recognize that God does not absolve us of the promises we made to human beings until we've repaired the wrong we've done. And then you fast all the way till the evening of the next day. Hanukkah, not the Jewish Christmas. Not an important holiday, created by the rabbis, comes out of the Maccabean period, the Judah the Maccabee, and it technically is the celebration of a military victory of the Maccabees over the proto-Christian Greek Assyrians. Assyrian Greeks, I should say. There's this whole story about the miracle of the oil made up by the rabbis. Sorry to tell you that I don't want to do the whole there's no Santa Claus thing, but the whole miracle of the oil was made up by the rabbis because there wasn't any God in the story. That too is a longer story. Just a taste. You want to learn more about that story? Take my next class. Purim. Purim is actually a great holiday. It happened just before Passover, and it celebrates the redemption or the salvation of the Jews from another time when they tried to kill us. This is the story of Esther in the Bible and the Jews of Persia, King Ahasuerus. There was a decision made to wipe out all the Jews. Esther, a heroine, reveals her Jewishness to the king, who is her husband, and he saves the Jews. It's one of the few stories that has a female hero in it, a heroine. In our Bible, we should have more of those. The women are actually much stronger characters than the men throughout the Bible. Yes, there's much drunkenness. So there is a tradition that you're supposed to get inebriated on Purim because they almost killed us and then they didn't. So we should drink to that. It's kind of a fraternity holiday, I guess. We are going to, there's no way I could do this class in an hour. We're going to go for another 15 minutes or so. If you need to drop out, you certainly can. So let's look at another text from the Bible. And this is the text having to do with something you might have seen on the doorpost of a Jewish house, a mezuzah. That amulet, that box that, I think I had one here someplace. I used to have them around, but I don't know. So that, here we are. I got it. So this is a mezuzah. Put that in focus a little bit. They can look like lots of things. This one has sticky on the back. Inside of it is a prayer that looks like this. Not that blurry. Blurry to you, but it's not blurry to me. This prayer is actually the Hebrew of what's on the screen. And it's written by a scribe, a sofer, written with a quill and ink. And it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, the Lord alone." That's called the Shema, the proclamation of monotheism in Judaism. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Take to heart these instructions which I charge you this day. Impress them upon your children. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are on your way, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." That's all from the Torah. So you've learned enough about Judaism now to say, well, what does that really mean? How do I do that? How do I get from that to this? It says, put it on the doorpost of your house. Why don't I just tack this up on the doorpost of my house? Well, it rains. And some rabbi, came up with, well, I'll make a product. I don't know. Came up with this. Then what should this look like? And is there a rule for the size that this is, the materials that are used? Can I make this out of pigskin? No. Can it be too big or too small? Where should I put it on the doorpost of my house? Left or right? Should it go like this? Go like this?
Yeah, it has to slant a certain way.
It does. And that's a great story as an explanation. So the rabbis say, just to that one question of putting it on the doorpost of your house, one rabbi said, put it like this. Another rabbi said, put it like this. The rabbi that won said, no, put it like this.
In the middle.
Compromise. And which way should it lean? Lean toward the house. Because when you make a compromise in favor of your family, compromise in favor of your home, and what we call Sholom Bayit, peace in your home. Again, an oversimplification. But that's where Jews get the mezuzah from. That's why almost every Jewish home has at least one of these on their front door. Later on, in the book of Numbers, we get another text, another symbol that you've probably seen before, which is the talit, or the fringes, the tzitzit. Men and women can wear them. And God, Adonai, said to Moses, saying, speak to the Israelite people and instruct them to make for themselves fringes on the corners of their garments through the ages. Let them attach a cord of blue to the fringe at each corner. That shall be your fringe. Look at it and recall all the commandments of Adonai and observe them, so that you do not follow your heart and eyes in your lustful urge. Thus you shall be reminded to observe all of my commandments and be holy to your God. I am Adonai, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am Adonai, your God. A lot is happening in this text. First of all, something happens even before this. So this is Numbers 15:37. But if you look at Numbers 15:36 and before that, there's a story of a man who goes out and cuts down a tree on the Sabbath. And Moses kills him for doing that with God's permission. And from that, this commandment is developed, because there are so many commandments that this guy forgot. You're not supposed to cut down a tree on the Sabbath. So we create the Jewish version of tying a string around your finger. And if you have this hanging off the corner of your garment, when you go to reach for your axe next time, you're going to run into the fringe and you're going to say, why are these fringes there? And then, like, prayer beads, you're going to run through all 613 commandments till you get to don't use your axe on the Sabbath to cut down a tree, and you're going to step away. Maybe. But again, the ritual object is not as important as the intention behind it. What's the intention here? It goes back to the very end of, or it's at the very end of this passage, which is, why should you remember these things? Why should you observe all these commandments and be holy? Because I'm God, and you assigned on to this system. I'm the God that redeemed you from Egypt. So if you know the story, you kind of abandoned me, Jewish people. For 435 years, you assimilated and you didn't practice Judaism. But then you cried out. This is our story. This is the narrative thread of Judaism. But after 435 years, you cried out to me in the pain of your slavery and suffering, and I showed up for you again. I kept my word. I kept the covenant. And for that reason, you need to keep your end of the deal. Remember, we talked about Judaism being a covenantal relationship, a brit, a contract. Okay, we could keep going and going. Well, I'll end with this, and that's my dog Mitzi. So a Hasidic saying, this is coming out of the shtetl of Eastern Europe. That's where Hasidic Judaism was. Their rabbis taught, not in the Talmud, but a later rabbi teaching, trying to interpret the intention of Jewish law, Jewish tradition, A person should have 2 slips of paper,
Come here.
which he carries with him all the time in each pocket. On one should be written, the whole world was created only for me and my sake. And on the other, I am but dust and ashes. Skip the second part of that, the Talmud piece, that's a separate quote. Why is this statement there? What does it teach us? You have to find balance in your life. Sometimes you reach into your pocket because it's all about you. And sometimes it's not at all about you. So what's my approach to living Judaism and living by the Torah? It's to try to find balance. You know, I think I said it last time. Philosopher Carly Marney taught, a window stuck open or a window stuck closed is useless as a door or a window. So we're constantly trying to find the balance. And when we stop living with Judaism, when Judaism stops being an action or an active thing, I would say this for any religion, that's when it gets into trouble. And so how do you go through life with Torah? You have to find the balance. How do you find the balance? Through study. And how do you find the balance through study? You don't study alone. You study with a guide. You study with wisdom. And that's where rabbis and synagogues and other scholars and communities come in to help interpret all of those things. I've been talking forever, so I'm going to stop talking. And I'm here to answer your questions for as long as you would like. If you need to go, you certainly can.
Do women wear talafit? Only
Can women
men?
wear talit? Yes, as you saw in the picture, absolutely they can. Do they know? And the reason, do they? Yes. In Orthodoxy, they don't. The reason is complicated, and it's not a proper interpretation, in my view, of the text. They can, but in Orthodoxy, it's a greater commandment to do something it's a greater mitzvah, it's a greater duty, let's put it that way, to do something you're commanded to do than to do something you choose to do. This is how Orthodoxy views things. So since a woman can choose to do it, but it's not commanded to do it, they don't do it. Whereas a man is commanded to do it, and therefore in doing it, fulfills the obligation of the covenant of doing what God requires of you. And that's at a higher level. I don't subscribe to that, but that's how that system works.
Right.
You're welcome, Charlie. My pleasure. Any other questions? Feel free to unmute and chime in.
I was thinking about what you were saying last session about the 2.5-year debate on whether God should have encouraged human, like injected humans into the equation. And I was actually Googling it and seeing other opinions about it. And at first, when you asked that question, I thought, of course we should be here. But then as I thought about it through the week, I came to the other decision that no, it probably would have been a better world if we hadn't been here. But what one of the rabbis had said was that we're here. There's nothing we can do about it. We didn't ask to be here. God put us here. And now, so it's up to us to just do the right thing and correct our behavior.
Right.
Correct
Yeah,
our past behavior and our future.
Right. You can live in this hypothetical world all you want, but the reality is you're here.
Yeah.
So the debate is really a thought experiment, but almost irrelevant. You're welcome, Blair.
Yeah.
What exactly is the kippah and why and where is it used and why and is it a mitzvah? So the yarmulke is a later convention or invention of Judaism. It actually comes out of Middle Eastern practice where it was customary to cover your head as a sign of respect. It's interesting. Nowadays you take off your head as a sign of respect. In Middle Eastern times you covered your head as a sign of respect. But the other symbolism of the yarmulke that has developed over time is that it reminds the person who wears one, that everything I do is under God. It's like living your life on camera. And I'll tell you, there have been times in my life when I wore a yarmulke everywhere, and I wear one now when I work and when I study and when I pray, but not if I'm going to the mall or shopping, unless I forget it's on or I'm just running around. But there's an obligation that comes with it. It's like wearing a uniform. I represent a team. So when I do have a yarmulke on, I feel an obligation to represent Judaism well. And that affects my day-to-day. So much so that sometimes I'll take it off because it's a Saturday and I'm in t-shirt and shorts and I'm running around and I might run into a congregate or something, a member of my synagogue, and what will they think? They're in t-shirts and shorts and running around also on Saturdays, but that's neither here nor there. So it obligates you, but fundamentally it's a sign of that God is above and that everything I do is under God's watchful eye, not in like a whatever, his Handmaid's Tale watchful eye, but just other questions. Can you share more about the different names for God? Are they interchangeable, or do different words have different meaning? Yes, they are. Yes, they have different meaning, and therefore they are not entirely interchangeable. According to Jewish tradition, there are 70 names for God. They all go to the attributes of God, that are God is judge, or God is compassionate, or God is forgiving, God is healing, those kinds of things.
Why did the Elenu or the Amidah become silent? Because there's so many references in it to opening your mouth to declare God's praise.
So thank you, Martina, for that question. So in the Jewish prayer service, there's a prayer called the Amidah, which means a standing prayer. It's an interesting prayer because it actually is the one prayer that is most directly connected to biblical Judaism. It replaced the sacrifice of the Bible. So the rabbis were attempting to do with words what used to be done with the spilling of blood or the burning of grain. And in it, the language of the Amidah, it imagines you in conversation with God as though God is seated as a king on a throne, and you have to go in and ask a request of God. And in fact, on the weekday,
3 feet back and forward.
Right, you step back and step forward. That's all choreography, as though you're walking into God's chamber, as though God were king. Most Jews only come to synagogue on Shabbat. And so on Shabbat, the Amidah is done out loud, because the Amidah is a song of praise on Shabbat. You're thanking God for the Sabbath. On the weekday, the Amidah is done privately, because it actually contains within it requests that you are making of God. Traditionally, 6 on behalf of yourself, 6 on behalf of the community. These are defined, and 1 that kind of bridges the gap. But you're also allowed to make your own personal petitionary prayers in that moment. You don't have to follow the prayer book, or you can add to. That's one of the reasons it's done silently, so that people have privacy in their petitionary prayers. We can all praise together. We can all say, God likes it when we all say thank you together. But if we're gonna complain and make requests, God likes to take those one by one.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Can I ask you something about what you said about the slaughtering of animals?
Sure.
A friend sent me a picture from New York City with the chickens, and there were people protesting the chickens. They're slaughtering chickens. There's blood flying everywhere.
Yeah.
What is that about?
Well, they're not protesting the chickens. They're protesting what people are doing with the chickens. They like the chickens very much.
Doing to the chickens. That's
right. What are they doing to the chickens?
Yeah.
Not good things. So this is a ridiculous, arcane custom that had been gotten away with and then brought back. Well, when it existed originally, it was for the poor. So this is a sacrificing of a chicken before Rosh Hashanah, before the Jewish New Year, to absolve you of sin. And the superstition that has developed out of this is what used to be is you would buy a chicken and you would give the chicken to the poor. And the shochet, the butcher, would kill the chicken. If you eat chicken, chances are it's been killed. That would kill the chicken and give it to the poor. But some Jew came along and said, wait, before you give that chicken, since I'm doing a mitzvah, since I'm doing something good, I want a blessing. I want to say, because I did this good thing, I should be absolved of sins. Now, that's not how it works, but that's where it came from. I don't know how they got from that to actually waving the chicken around your head. You go to Jerusalem before Rosh Hashanah in the Machane Yehuda, in the market in Jerusalem, you will see this. You will
do it in Brooklyn.
You will see this. They wave the chicken around their head, not like this, but like this, as though everything that you have done in that area should be absolved because of the good deed of you giving this chicken to the poor. I think it's ridiculousness, but there's a lot of religions out there and a lot of Judaism that has ridiculousness in it. I choose to ignore that stuff.
I was absolutely shocked. I thought it was really barbaric, and I'm like, but everybody was covered in blood. It was, I don't know.
Well, if you do it right, you don't get blood on you. You're not supposed to get the blood on.
Well, it was all over their faces.
I've never done it. I've only seen it.
They had a free for all.
Right. I've never done it. I've only seen it. So men wear a kippah, but women never do. That's not true. Women will wear yarmulkes, or kippah, same word, Yiddish and Hebrew. But generally, it's become a newer practice. Many women of a certain age didn't have a bat mitzvah because that didn't really come into fruition until like the 1970s. First bat mitzvah was in the 1920s in the United States, but it really didn't become popular until the 60s or 70s. And even then, it was often less than what the boys did. So it's a generational thing, and still, it's just kind of a matter of convention as to whether women feel like they want to wear a head covering or not.
Some women will wear wigs or a head.
Right, that's a different. Right, so the purpose of covering hair is a different thing.
Right.
Okay, I think I've covered most of the questions. Before I talked about the temple being destroyed, or am I talking about the tabernacle? No, the tabernacle was the Ark of the Covenant, Raiders of the Lost Ark stuff that was carried in the desert and then placed in the temple. And yes, according to tradition, the Ark of the Covenant was carried off when the Babylonians destroyed the temple. We don't know what happened to it. So it was there. But here we're talking about the actual physical temple being destroyed. Are women considered equal in Judaism? No, they're actually considered to be on a higher spiritual plane. It's not how it works, because so often history is written by men and religion is written by men, but women are actually considered to be on a higher spiritual plane because they bring life and men don't. Women are not obligated to positive time-bound commandments because they have a more important task than showing up at the synagogue and daven praying 3 times a day. Their task is raising children and educating them and managing the home and making the home a safe and peaceful place. There is no more important task in society than the raising of children and the creating of a peaceful home. And that task is given very specifically and explicitly to women. What we have done in Western society to diminish that is our fault. But traditionally, the way that Judaism was written, and by our fault, I mean the rabbis of the Talmud's fault and beyond, but traditionally, Judaism ascribes to women a higher status than men. Okay, I think, how does the violence of the Bible contrast with the loving God? Not well. I have to think that these are stories that were written for the audience of their time, right? So, like, I watch movies today with my kids, and they're not at all movies that are written for me. My movies are, I don't know, 16 Candles and Animal House, Top Gun. That's what I grew up with. The stuff that's on their films, they are not written for me, but it speaks to them. So I think that's not too far removed from, this was a story that was written in very graphic terms for people that were very familiar with animal husbandry and getting their hands dirty and rendering their own food and all of these things. And so some of the stuff that we see is tremendously, nauseating was not to them, or it was because it had to be so much more so because they had stronger constitutions than we did. That's one approach. It's a complicated question and a more complicated answer. Okay, we're at 8:30 now. I think we've done enough to this today. I will send out to you tomorrow these slides and a list of films that you might want to watch that will help flush out some more of your curiosity about Judaism. Thank you all very much for tonight. Sorry for the dog barking.
Thank you.
And I will see you, those that I didn't scare away, I'll see you next week.